Welcome to the fifth episode of our podcast. Today I'm joined by Christopher Hopkinson. He's assistant professor at the University of Ostrava and he's also the English voice of Ostrava. He started his translation services almost 25 years ago, working with universities, public sector and companies. This is Expat Episodes, where new stories begin. I'm Martin, your host, and I'll be guiding you through the stories of expats in the Czech Republic. Hello, Chris. Thank you for taking the time to join me.
Hello, it's a pleasure.
Can we maybe start with a small introduction because I've done my homework on you. I don't know if our listeners know about you.
Well, yeah, my name's Chris Hopkinson. I'm originally from England many years ago, but I've lived here in Ostrava for 25 years actually now. And my speciality is language. I'm a linguist. I'm a translator. I translate from Czech into English, and I'm also a university teacher of English and linguistics and translation here at the University of Ostrava.
So, have you always been a teacher?
Not always. For most of my professional life, yes. But right back when I finished university, I went into a rather different line of business. I went into HR and worked. This was back in the UK, back in England, and I worked in HR for a couple of years before, I suppose, reorienting myself and deciding that that wasn't really for me. And then I came out here and changed my career direction. I set up a business as a translator and an academic as well. So I have those two strands going side by side as a commercial translator and also a university teacher.
So, you translate into Czech or from Czech?
From Czech into English, yeah. I mean, there are, because it's not my native language, there are plenty of people who can do English to Czech translation a lot better than I can. So, I think everybody should do what they're good at.
What prompted you to start learning Czech?
Well, I'm the generation that when I was in my late teens, that was when communism collapsed, basically, and so suddenly there was a whole bunch of countries in Central and Eastern Europe which were opening themselves up. Previously, it wasn't really very practically possible to come and live here and work here, and many people wouldn't have wanted to anyway. But I thought, well, this is an interesting opportunity. I knew I wanted to study foreign languages, and I knew that one of those foreign languages would be German. A language I still love to this day. And I felt that the ideal combination would be with one of the Central European languages. So I did a quick trip out to this part of Europe. This was pre-budget flights, so it involved sitting on a bus for 40 hours. And I went to Poland and Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and Hungary, and this was the country I liked the best. So my combination of languages to study at university was then German and Czech. So
This is a very, I would say, interesting language combination because we've got a Germanic language and a Slavic language,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So was it hard for you to learn both of them simultaneously?
Yes. But the long answer is, I mean, my German was already okay, so German wasn't really the problem. But coming to a Slavic language as a complete beginner is a challenge. And there's kind of no way around that challenge. The structure of the language is very complex. The vocabulary is unfamiliar. If you're an English speaker, there's very little vocabulary in Slavic languages that you're really familiar with. So yeah, I mean, it was difficult. It wasn't so much difficult to combine it with the Germanic language, but simply something extremely new. And also, I was 18, and although that is certainly not old, your brain works differently when it's learning something at age 18 to, if I'd started to learn Czech when I was 7 or 8, then yeah, that would have been a whole lot easier and I would have had more time to do it as well. So yeah, learning as an adult is more challenging, I think.
I see. So, what was the most challenging aspect of Czech language, would you say?
Well, initially the vocabulary, simply the vocabulary. It's just a whole load of vocabulary, which is you feel like you have nothing to hold on to. Yeah, and very occasionally you'll find a word which is an international word. So you have words like moderni, and you think, fine, that means modern, fine, or tradiční means traditional, that's fine. So there are words that you can hold on to, but relatively little. And my language background before then was learning basically French, where the vocabulary is extremely similar to English, maybe 60-70% of it is basically the same, and German, where the vocabulary is a bit more difficult, but I'd been learning German for a while, and like English, they're both Germanic languages, so you have something to hold on to. With a Slavic language, not so much.
I see. And so you spoke about you being on a trip to Czechoslovakia,
Yeah,
Poland, and Hungary.
Hungary, yeah.
Why Ostrava?
Well, Ostrava came a little bit later. That was when I was already studying at university. Back then, the bachelor degree was basically a 4-year course. This was at Oxford University. Other universities will do it in a slightly different way. But the Oxford Bachelor degree in Modern Languages was 4 years, and it was basically 3 years in Oxford and then a year abroad, where it was, I suspect it's a bit more structured now, but back then it was very much kind of, well, you go abroad and you do your own thing, and as long as you bring back the results and pass your exams at the end of the year, then you've spent your year well. So luckily, Oxford had contacts with a number of Czech universities, and it had contacts with Charles University in Prague, with Olomouc, and here with Ostrava. And Ostrava was a very new university at that time, unlike the other two, which were very established. And I decided that I didn't want to spend a year in Prague because there would have been a real risk of me just kind of talking to other expats and not really learning much about Czech culture, let alone the language. So that left me Olomouc and Ostrava. And so I took a little look at what I could find out about those places. And I myself come from a place which is not unlike Ostrava. It's an industrial city, or a former industrial city. And although Olomouc is absolutely lovely, I fancied spending time in a city that was a bit kind of bigger and more potentially exciting.
So what is the city that you are comparing to Ostrava, or that is similar to Ostrava?
Well, I'm originally from the city of Sheffield, in England, and I grew up partly there and partly in the neighbouring city of Nottingham, which is kind of similar in a way. I mean, Sheffield historically was all about steel, and Nottingham and that area historically was all about coal. So, and they're not far apart. It's maybe, I don't know, 70 kilometers apart. So it's all one region, really. So yeah, the Ostrava is almost like a Czech Sheffield or a Czech Pittsburgh, or, any other steel city you can think of.
So how would you say that Ostrava transitioned from the industrial sector to nowadays? Like, how would you rate it to, or compare it to Sheffield?
Well, it's been a fascinating process to watch. The steel industry in Sheffield went into decline earlier than that process happened here in Ostrava, and so really right from the 1980s, steel in Sheffield went into decline, and there is some left. It's managed to kind of retain some of the really high quality kind of niche manufacturing. So, high quality like surgical steel, that kind of thing for surgical implements. But the big mass production has gone, and it went already in the 80s. So Ostrava started that process maybe 10 years later. And the whole process here, the whole transformation of this city is like, it's as if 50 years of change have been compressed into half that time. So the process was quicker. And in many ways, I think that Ostrava has managed it more successfully than not only Sheffield, but a lot of post-industrial British cities did. So, we kind of made mistakes in Western Europe, which when Czech industry was transitioning and transforming itself, then people were able to learn from those mistakes. So, for example, I mean, we're sitting here in Vítkovice, in Dolní Vítkovice. Sheffield could potentially have had a place like this, but it doesn't. I mean, they've they've tried to do some things. There are kind of visitor attractions, and some of them are very good. But the old the east end of Sheffield, basically, you could drive through there and essentially, drive for 7-8 kilometers through not a lot and have no real indication that there used to be one of the world's great steel industries there. There's only tiny little bits of it. So there's nothing which has been converted into like this major visitor attraction like here in Vítkovice, which is quite a phenomenal thing, I think.
Perfect. I'm really, really happy to hear that you see it that way. And you came here the pre-transition.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of Ostrava?
The first impression I had, I suppose, was that it felt very remote. It felt far from everywhere. That was partly because just getting here was kind of challenging compared to now. There was no airport. Well, there was an airport, but there were no kind of commercial flights that I remember. So you had to get, first of all, to Prague, which either meant flying very expensively or getting a bus more cheaply, but possibly it wasn't worth it. And then from Prague to here, the fastest train took like 6.5 hours, And if you got a slower train, then, I mean, that was all day, basically. So, the time's now being cut in half, and it feels so much more connected. Also, I mean, now the place feels connected to Poland, for example. And back then, certainly there wasn't this sense of Poland being like a very close neighbor. I mean, the people from Poland come to Ostrava all the time for entertainment, for shopping, for culture, and vice versa. If you go to the Katowice area, you hear plenty of Czech people. So it feels very much like a natural connection. Back then, you didn't hear Polish people very much in Ostrava. You didn't see Polish cars on the roads because I suppose there was no reason for them to come here. So it kind of felt isolated from its immediate neighbor. It felt quite isolated from Prague. It felt weirdly more connected with Vienna than it was to Prague, although I think that's still the case personally. But it felt very remote, and now it just feels a lot more connected. I mean, that's because communications have changed, and the whole infrastructure, like transport, has changed dramatically. You have to remember this was when I first came here. It was 1993 or 94. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, it was a long time ago. We're talking 30 years ago, and the transformation since then has been absolutely huge.
So when was the point that you really fell in love with this place?
I kind of fell in love with it pretty much straight away, and I suppose back then, we're talking about 1990s Ostrava. When I traveled to other parts of this country and, got talking to people, and mentioned that, and they say, well, where are you living? And I said, Ostrava. Then they often they'd make this kind of face like, why, like, what a weirdo. Why would you want to go there? And that builds a very kind of, an almost kind of like a fortress mentality. It's like, well, yeah, we're Ostrava, and maybe people don't understand us, but, you know, we're good. So I very quickly, I mean, you know, I made lots of friends very quickly, both kind of in my private life and also at work, you know, working for the university. So I found it a very kind of open, welcoming community back then. And the fact that the rest of the country kind of looked down on us a little bit only made that feeling stronger. So it came very, very quickly that I fell in love with the place. And then, you know, I started going to see Baník Ostrava regularly, and that kind of, you know, it's sport is a part of the professional sport is basically a way of expressing connection to a community, isn't it? So, you know, that kind of builds a bond with the city and so on.
Particularly because football is really, I guess, popular in north of England, right? Or in England in
Yeah,
general.
sure. Yeah, that's right. I think, you know, everywhere in, well, everywhere in England and Scotland, certainly. Yeah. So yes, I mean that was what kind of drew me naturally.
So
Ice hockey
you're
came later.
Baníkovec then.
I am. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. We're
Good to
we're
know.
we're known
And
everywhere.
and you mentioned your beginnings at the university. Could you please walk me through that? How does one you know start working as an assistant professor at University of Ostrava? How do you start writing research papers and stuff?
Well, you back then the process was a lot less structured than it is now. It was, I suppose, I don't mean to sound negative about it, but it wasn't quite the professional setup that it is today. You know, we're talking nearly 30 years ago. So there was a lot of kind of improvisation, and my early beginnings writing research papers were basically a story of trial and error. Like I think most academics began like that, and the kind of formal structures weren't really there. So you just kind of came, and I was initially hired just as like a native speaker, you know, to teach practical language classes. And we had plenty of native speakers, you know, they'd come from, some came from Britain, Ireland, the US, Canada, and they'd generally stay for a year or 2 years. And I didn't really know whether I would want to stay for longer at that time, but I just kind of found my feet there, I suppose, and decided that I wanted to stay. And so I decided that, you know, I wasn't going to spend the rest of my professional life just teaching practical language classes, but that I was going to do the necessary degrees, get a doctorate, and, you know, become an academic alongside working as a translator. So yeah, it was more or less a kind of a process of improvisation. I didn't really go into it with like a clear career goal that I'm going to have a doctorate in 10 years' time or something like that. It kind of just happened.
See. So could you maybe tell me more about your career as a translator? Because I know that you work with the public sector, with universities, and also the private sector.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
what about your cooperation with the public sector? What are some of the maybe most interesting clients that you had to deal with?
Well, for many, many years, I've cooperated with the city of Ostrava. I mean, that goes back more than 20 years now. So whenever they need some kind of English language presentation that's going to be focused on the public, you know, whether it's press releases or websites or videos, you know, promotional videos or whatever it is, or annual reports, then I suppose I'm I'm probably their kind of first choice for that. I mean, I know there are a couple of translators who also contribute. So they're a real kind of long-term client. And I've done work for other cities in the past, so I became like the kind of court translator of Pardubice for a while, and then sometimes there are then staff changes, somebody moves on, somebody decides that they don't want to do so much English presentation anymore. But so towns and cities, and as you say, also universities. I've worked with. Well, not most Czech universities, but certainly a decent number of them. I have contacts. I work with people at Banska, at the Technical University here in Ostrava. I've worked with Brno and Zlín and Olomouc and Charles University in Prague and a few more. So yeah.
So how is it to deal with, I guess, clients or colleagues from a different culture to you? Because you're from England and now you have had to start dealing with Czech people.
Yeah. Well, I never really found that too much of a problem, to be honest. I mean, when I'm dealing with clients, I only really kind of have one principle, which is just kind of well, I suppose it's a principle for life generally. If you treat people with respect, then you get that back generally, in 99% of cases. I don't BS my clients. If I think that, for example, something needs to be done differently in the text, then I will offer that advice. Sometimes I'll offer it, tactfully and respectfully. And generally, in 99% of cases, the clients kind of realize, I suppose I try to add that extra value, so instead of just translating a text, I'm kind of almost like co-creating a text, almost like you're on the boundary between translation and actual copywriting. So, kind of writing promotional text is a very demanding skill. And promotional texts in Czech and in English aren't quite the same. You sometimes have to make changes beyond just putting it from one language into another. Yeah.
Definitely. So that was the business side. What about the academic side with your colleagues?
So my experience with my colleagues, this was an interesting one. I mean, when I started working for the English department here at the University of Ostrava, everything was very different to what it was now. The department was relatively small. It was really in its infancy. It had only really been going for, it must have been 5 years when I arrived. So since the University of Ostrava was actually established. So it was very much a kind of a process of improvisation, and all of the professional structures that govern educational provision now in higher education have come since then. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, there was an accreditation system back then, but it was a lot looser than it is now. So now it's like the higher education structure is pretty much like it is anywhere in a developed country. Back then, it was just kind of finding its feet. It was transitioning out of a system that worked very differently under the previous regime. So what I found coming here was a very kind of tight-knit, close-knit group of colleagues, many of whom very quickly became friends. They were very kind of open, very welcoming, and there are quite a few of them who are still my colleagues today. So I've known them 30 years, which is more than half of my life. It makes me kind of feel very old thinking of it like that. Yeah, I mean, the kind of professional support that I got from my colleagues was, really valuable and helped me a lot, especially in those early stages.
Would you say that wasn't the same in England?
Certainly not. I mean, the company that I worked for in England when I was doing the HR work was just a big, established corporation, and it already had those kind of very professional systems. in place, and the workplace vibe was, it was generally quite pleasant enough. I mean, there was nothing hugely unpleasant. I mean, it's like anywhere you throw 100 people together and not everybody's going to get on. But there wasn't that feeling of almost being like a little kind of family. I don't want to sentimentalize it too much, but it did feel like a kind of almost like a friend group, or at least a core group of colleagues. And yeah, back in the UK, we didn't really have that. It was more professional, I suppose.
I see. So, would you say that you still use or that you retain some of the HR best practices and you employ them in your classes now?
I, I'd hope so. I suppose what I took away from my time in HR was that that there's a tendency in any company to view people, to view employees as kind of units of production. And in a sense, they are. They're contributing to the profits of the company, hopefully. But if you work in HR, then of course you have that view, but you also get to see the kind of the more human side of it. And I suppose what I've always tried to put into practice is this idea that students aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet to be moved through the system and to be get them graduating as soon as possible, but that everyone's an individual and people respond differently to different things. Some people are very outgoing and you need to be able to deal with that, because sometimes a student will be kind of almost too outgoing and will monopolize the discussion in the class. Other students are a lot shyer, and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily not taking an interest or that they're not getting something from the teaching, but they just kind of process the ideas and the information in a different way, and they kind of have to do it in their own head without interaction. So yeah, I mean, I suppose what I took away from HR is that idea of individuality and kind of treating people as much as possible as individuals.
So you didn't have any prior teaching experience to this?
No, I didn't. Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear you describe it this way, right? Because when we think about it, most university teachers or lecturers, they don't have any experience with teaching, right? So
Yeah, sure.
maybe it helped you to have worked in the HR before.
Maybe it did. That's right. Because yeah, I know what you mean. A lot of academics, for a lot of academics, teaching is it's almost like something that they do on the side. Yeah, it is the way the system is set up in the academic world. What you get really evaluated on is your publications, your research. We get measured on that. We don't get measured for our teaching activity. There's no quality measurement for teaching or anything like that. There is quality measurement for publications and research. So yeah, in higher education, certainly, I think for a lot of academics, teaching is something. I don't mean that they don't devote time to it. Clearly they do, but it's never going to be a priority unless it's directly linked to pay, yeah? Which our academic work, our research, our publications are directly linked, yeah, but teaching isn't. So yeah, but I mean, and that goes for me as well. But yeah, I suppose I've always seen teaching as a kind of a bigger part of the whole than it is for many academics. And I don't want to generalize. I mean, there are plenty of academics who are incredibly enthusiastic teachers and they love the teaching side of the job, but there are plenty of academics who don't really enjoy teaching. And I mean, that's not just here. That was the same. I can remember studying in the UK when I was doing my bachelor degree. There were a few teachers there who you just knew they really hated teaching. They would have ideally liked to spend all day writing, research articles.
So you've worked for the private sector, you were an entrepreneur, and you work for the academia or the public sector.
Yeah.
Which role do you feel most comfortable in?
Um, that's difficult to say. I mean, what I like is the combination. I like the fact that I'm constantly kind of hopping between one and the other, or well, hopping. I'm doing them both at the same time, and I don't really see any kind of conflict in that. I mean, one of my main areas of teaching is translation. I mean, I teach translation courses at the university here. If I wasn't a translator myself, I couldn't do that, could I? Well, I mean, I could have a go at it, but I'm not sure how much value those lessons would have for the students. So I kind of see them as more intertwined, and they complement each other rather than being particularly different.
Which is also important because you really have the hands-on experience with translating, and you also have the theoretical knowledge that is.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that you theory without any kind of practical basis is kind of pointless, and trying to do some kind of practical task without a bit of a wider knowledge of the theoretical basis will, well, you might be able to do something well by instinct, but you're never going to achieve very much if you don't have that kind of slightly wider view of it. So I think, yeah, that theory and practice are very much kind of interrelated. And, I've always felt that even when I'm teaching more what you might think of as theoretical courses in linguistics, I always try to explain things from the perspective of how language is actually working in everyday life, because just seeing it as some abstract system, there is that. I mean, it's an important aspect of it, but I always like to kind of bring it down to real life examples.
Okay, Chris. So unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our episode, so I have 5 final questions for you.
Okay.
So how do you keep your cultural roots alive?
To be honest, it's not too difficult for me because most of my professional life kind of takes place in English, or at least using English. So there's no danger that I'm going to somehow lose touch with the language. And then really, I consume English language media, whether that's news media or entertainment media or, whatever. Clearly nowadays I can listen to or watch pretty much whatever British content I want, where I want to, when I want to. So there's no difference there. I can kind of like mentally shift myself to inhabit like a British cultural space for 3 hours and then come back to, my real life, if you like.
If your time in Ostrava or the Moravian Silesian region was a movie or a song, which one would it be?
Well, I've thought about this, and although it's a song I don't really like, I'm going to say I'll have a variation on Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, and I'll call it Moravian Silesian Rhapsody. It's a
I like
terrible
that.
joke, isn't it? But yeah, I just like the title of the song, and it's like yeah.
So what makes you want to call Ostrava your home?
Wh- Whenever I'm away for a longish period of time, I pretty quickly start missing the place. Yeah, that's all. I mean, it's about the people and the places, and I mean, I've lived most of my adult life here, so it's very much home. It's not like a new thing for me.
So when you say you're feeling homesick, would you say you feel homesick for Ostrava or for Sheffield?
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely, yeah.
Perfect. So what is your special hidden gem in Ostrava?
Well, I suppose I would say two things. One is my seat at Baník Ostrava at the football, and my seat at Vítkovice as well. So yeah, so hockey and football places, but also kind of being out and about in the city. What I love is there's a whole hidden world here, which is the rivers. Ostrava is on rivers. Obviously, you've got loads of rivers coming together, and if you're just in a car or a tram, then you kind of often don't know that these riverside areas are there because roads don't usually go there. But if you're walking or cycling, then often they have cycle paths along them, or you can walk along them if you're into the kind of urban exploration going off path. And it's absolutely fascinating. You can be 100 meters away from a motorway or, a retail park or, a factory complex. And you don't really know they're there because you're down in this world where there's woodland, there are meadows, there's wildlife, and often all of that woodland will it damps the sound down, so you can be in those places and they're quiet and peaceful in the middle of the city. And I love that fact that it's like this it's almost like the city exists on two levels. You've got like the upper level where, there are, like, looking out of the window, there are cars and trucks and trams and people and shops, and then you've got that lower level, which is just it just exists there next to us. And if you like that kind of, urban exploring, then it's absolutely ideal. It's like nature within the city.
What about tips for a trip to England or Sheffield?
I would say if you're going to England and you want to get a real sense of what the country is like, then my recommendation would be take a trip along the coasts, because they're not like the most sexy parts of the country. Tourists who go to England, they'll go typically to the cities. They'll go to London and Oxford and Bath and York and places like that, which are wonderful, of course. But if you travel along the coasts, well, first of all, you'll get some amazing landscapes, and the contrasts are absolutely huge. If you go right down to the very far southwest, it's kind of almost subtropical. There are palm trees, essentially. There are orange trees, in a few places, and spectacular rocks and cliffs, and when the sun's out, then amazing turquoise blue water. And then if you carry round and go up the east coast, then it gets very much kind of wilder and more rugged, and then there are parts of the east coast where the coastline is more or less below sea level, and it's completely flat. And so you get these, in a relatively small space, amazing contrasts in scenery. And you also get some really interesting towns as well, and cities, because one of England's great glories for me is its ports. And, I've always loved ports. And, you can go to somewhere like Liverpool, which, we talked earlier about Ostrava being regenerated, or, Liverpool, I think, is a good example of how the docks, which used to serve the Atlantic trade, Liverpool used to be the main port for America, Europe's main American port. That all collapsed essentially in the 1980s, and the whole dockland, the whole waterfront has been beautifully regenerated, and there are museums, and there's been renovations of some of the historic docks. So, whether you like nature or you're into kind of big, exciting cities, then I would say go to the coast.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for joining me. It's my pleasure and honor as your student to have the opportunity
Yes.
to question you. So
My pleasure
thank you.
too. Thank you very much.
And I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.
This podcast is proudly brought to you by Ostrava Expat Center with the media partnership from magazine Patrio.